Hi everybody, welcome to this afternoon's session. I'm just going to give it a minute or so to allow people to join the Zoom room before we get started. But you're very welcome to this third session in our series of equality, diversity and inclusivity sessions. Okay, the initial flurry seems to have stopped. So I will say welcome to everybody and thank you for joining us. This is our third co-sponsored session between the Sustainable Management of UK Marine Resources Programme, the Marine Social Science Network and the Social Science Task Group of the Marine Science Coordinating Committee. So we're very pleased to have you here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We have a great programme of speakers for today's session. Before I get started, just to remind you that this is, as I said, our third session. We've had two previous sessions on equality, diversity, inclusivity, but the first being on race and ethnicity, and the second on access and disability. And both of those sessions that were held before Christmas are available on the Marine Social Science Network YouTube channel. I can pop the links in the chat. And they're also, I think, on the SMMR website as well. So they are available. Today's session is being recorded and will be available today or tomorrow as well. So please feel free to distribute it to whoever you think might be interested in the session. We are planning a fourth session in this series around youth voices, and we'll be trying to confirm that date in the next week or so. We'll make sure to distribute that information when we have it. So the programme, as I said, is around this very broad topic of equality, diversity, inclusivity, and we're not trying to be exhaustive. We can't cover every topic as it needs to be in these sessions. But what we wanted to do is bring together a programme of speakers who could get us thinking and make sure that as we, as the marine science community, think about new projects, project funding, our own research and practice, that we are considering the issues that are being raised by our speakers. So today's session is on gender, and we have two speakers. Our first is Madeleine Gustavsen, who's a researcher at Ruralis in Norway. Madeleine is a researcher in areas around gender and fisheries, and will be speaking to us on some of the work that she's been doing over the last few years. So Madeleine, I'll welcome you to put your screen on and come and join us. There you go. And I'll stay on while you come to share your slide.
Absolutely. And just double check that I get this right before you leave.
No problem. Just as a reminder, while Madeleine's getting her slides up, please feel free to live tweet about the session, and I'll pop the tags for our speakers in the chat in just a second as well. And you can tag MarSocSci and use the hashtag MarSocSci. And if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box of Zoom as well. And I'll keep an eye on chat just in case, but if you could try and put them in the Q&A function, that would be great. Madeleine, I can see your slides. I can hear you perfectly. Oh, it's gone to
the wrong one.
It's gone the other way.
Okay. I wish it was
there we go.
The other way around, because sorry.
That's okay. Do you want to swap?
Yeah, how do I do that? Because otherwise I'm gonna look at this direction when I speak to you. But maybe that's okay. Maybe I don't have to look directly at you.
That's fine.
So you'll see my chin.
No problem. All right, I'll hand over to you if you're happy.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Madeleine.
So 2 seconds. Sorry for the technical little issues there. So hi everyone, my name is Madeleine Gustavsen. I am a researcher at Ruralis based in Norway, as Emma was just saying. But before I started working for Ruralis, I was leading a research project on women in fisheries in the UK, and I was based at the University of Exeter. And that research project was on it was funded by the Economics and Social Research Council, and it ended in 2020. So yeah, and the title of that work was Exploring the Changing Roles, Identities and Wellbeing of Women in Small-Scale Fishing Families. Okay, so, and the overarching aim of this project was, sorry, I hope this is not in the way. Okay, let me know if there are some issues with this screen. So the overarching aim of this project was to develop an empirical and theoretical understanding of the changing identities and well-being of women in small-scale fishing families in the context of the roles they play in responding to recent and ongoing economic downturns in this sector. Just to, first of all, I just wanted to say that obviously this seminar is about gender, and I'm not going to be talking to everything that is on that topic. This presentation will be very much focused on the work that I did in this project. For example, I just want to highlight here that even if I only introduced some limited background here in this presentation, there's plenty of really important work that has been done on gender issues in fisheries all over the world. So just so you are very clear that this is a sort of a perspective or one findings from one research project, basically. So in the UK, previous research in Northern England had found that women were part of capture fisheries, they're part of families and communities, they are part of trading, processing, and management and administration. And some very important work had been highlighting that women's contributions are often seen as help rather than work. And I think this quote here is very important. It's from Sao et al., who did a study in Northern England in 2013. And they say that women are not only engaged as visible and paid workers, but also as invisible and unpaid workers with a wide range of roles and tasks. They contribute significantly to the industry, but are underrepresented, underrecognized, unpaid or underpaid, with little say in decision-making at all levels. And I think the reason why I wanted to show that quote is that it's a very good quote. It's also some of the things that I've found in my own research, but I think I want to go dig into some of these the issues highlighted here more in depth. Another thing is that there's been a limited understanding of, in a sort of statistical sense, in a sort of quantified sense, how what women are doing in the fishing industry. And there's now a fairly old study, and European Union Commission study done by Katia Frangoides in France on the number of women who are involved in different parts of the fishing sector. And in 2012, that number came out to approximately 15%. But the problem was that was said to be aquaculture and fisheries in a very sort of broad sense, and it was quite difficult to know exactly what women were actually doing. And more recently, there has been another EU report that was released in 2019 on social data in the EU fishery sector. And that highlighted that women took a very small, there were very few women involved in the fishing industry, basically, but they fulfilled mainly onshore roles such as accounting and administrative roles, and that noted that there were also some women working as deckhands. But I suppose this report also went into the it was quite ambitious in that it tried to quantify this sort of unpaid labor that women were doing as well. And it landed on a very low number, on around 21 women that supported fishing families or fishing businesses. And I think that's some kind of, I mean, it is quite a big underrepresentation. And I think there's clearly a need of sort of a more qualitative work to understand what's the sort of cultural reasons, the underlying issues that lead to these kinds of methodological issues that we can observe. And so what I did in my research here that took place in 2018 to 2020 was to do in-depth qualitative interviews with 24 women. Sounds very little, but it was quite hard work to get to do that. And I was focused on understanding the lived experiences of these women by exploring their biographical narratives. And as I was saying, this was quite a challenging thing to do because women who are part of the fishing industry is, I would argue, a quite hard to reach group. So I casted like a really wide net in trying to get hold of people that to speak to. So I recruited through social media, through direct emails. I was cold calling people. I was reaching out to other researchers and practitioners to ask if they knew anyone in their particular area that might be relevant to this research project. I used chain referral sampling where that was possible. So I ended up speaking with women who fish, women who work with fish, for example, with processing, selling or marketing fish, women who worked in fisheries organizations or associations, and women that were both also part of fishing families. And the interviews were professionally transcribed and I analyzed them thematically. So as I was saying, this research project ended in 2020, which means I've had some time to publish from this work. So here are some publications that have been coming out of this work. And in the interest of time, I'm going to try to focus on 3 of these areas or 3 of these key themes. So it's resilience and well-being, women's belongings in UK fisheries, and women's entrepreneurship in the UK fisheries. So just the first theme here is resilience and well-being. And I apologize, I need to look here because here it's where I have my notes. So I co-wrote a paper with researchers from another research project, which was called the Fisher's Health Project. And this paper was recently published in Society Natural Resources. So the aim of the paper was to investigate women's roles in supporting the social resilience of fishing families and communities, and the implications of these roles for their own well-being. And we particularly focused in on 3 different themes. So the first one was that of women's economic support. So we found that women often had important paid employment. They were often referring to themselves in those roles as sort of subsidizing fishing businesses, not always, but particularly in times of crises, that their income was what the family could fall back on, or what the fishing business also could fall back on. And particularly one woman mentioned an experience of where her partner's boat had sunk, and obviously that meant that they didn't have income from that for some time. So in that sense, women are participating in sort of making fishing businesses more resilient, I suppose you can say. But they were also maintaining the social fabric of fisheries by nurturing the physical and mental well-being of fishing families and fishers. So women often mentioned they felt like single mothers. They couldn't plan things because they couldn't expect, or they couldn't plan things thinking that their partner would be involved. They had to plan things not expecting them to be there, because fishers would miss birthdays, they would miss key events in life, so to speak. And that was obviously because if there was a good day of fishing, they couldn't lose out on that opportunity, because that would be a loss of income. So they independently planned activities with their children. They were beyond sort of providing support to children, they also mediated relationships between fishers and their children. and they provided emotional support to partners. And this Fisher's Health Project also found that they often took responsibility for partners' physical health by, for example, contacting doctors or making appointments. But what we also found was that these supporting roles also had negative impact on women's own well-being. For example, this was associated with multiple forms of stress. So, for example, that stress was related to having these multiple roles, but also there was a stress related to the fishing business, changing regulatory frameworks, challenging paperwork that was associated with that, financial hardship, and stress related to this. And they also often mentioned that they could not become ill, and they experienced, because there would be no one else to take care of everyone. And they also experience loneliness and isolation, so social isolation. So I suppose the point is that women are very much part of creating the sort of building resilience in fishing communities and fishing families and fishing in the fishing industry, and their sort of well-being creators. Let's say that without having a better word in mind at the moment. And the second theme I wanted to focus on here was a paper I wrote on women's belongings, practices of belonging in UK fisheries. So I think the sort of thinking here was that was around sort of how can we understand women's shared experiences when they do not necessarily share a particular identity in the fishing industry. So what tended to happen, I suppose, women in a previous study I did, I found that women often downplay their own involvement in fishing by not saying that they're part of fishing, and others would do the same. So if you ask a fisherman if his partner, his wife is involved, you know, you have to follow up with more direct questions to actually get them to say a bit more about that, the nature of that involvement, let's say. Anyways, so and also, like, the identity of a fisher or fisherman is often very well understood, but then we have this idea of like women in fisheries who are a very diverse group. They don't necessarily they have very different positions in the fishing industry, but what is it that kind of how can we understand how they're a part of fishing? That is the question here, basically. So I turn to this idea of belonging that can help us understand sort of the fishery specific, or in this context specific, notions of socio-spatial inclusions and exclusions. So there are these three concepts: the place belongingness, the politics of belonging, and more than human co-constructions of belonging. And this, I'll try to explain this a bit better. So in this paper, or in my work, I've found that the most sort of overt expression of place belongingness was demonstrated by women that came from intergenerational fishing families. And they were very much connected to the family legacy in fishing. And there are also women who are obviously partnered into fishing by partnering with a fisher person. And these women had too a very strong emotional connection to the industry community. And what these both positions kind of revealed was that a lot of women organized their work life around fishing. They often express wanting to work in the industry as opposed to another job on the same sort of pay bracket. Women had a sense of feeling at home in fishing places, and what that ended up being was that women were actually practicing their belonging to these fishing communities, and it shaped their everyday lives, and in effect it kind of contributed to making fishing places. So in terms of both kind of maintaining them and changing them over time, what I found is that this kind of more naturalized sense of belonging to fishing did often not challenge sort of gendered positions in fishing, though. Women who fished, on the other hand, often reported very much enjoying the nature of the job. They expressed that they loved fishing, but belonging is not only about sort of feeling at home, but also about feeling recognized and understood. And these women often reported that they were longing to belong, and they wanted to belong, and fishing was a way for them to actually belong to community. But there were also some accounts of women who fished who were reported that they didn't receive the equal recognition to that of men. And interviews revealed examples of women having to sort of actively engage in sort of gender disobedient activities or practices. So they engaged a sort of politics of belonging to receive that recognition. And then the third theme was this theme of more than human co-constructions of belonging. So women were also their belongings were also co-constructed in relation to the materialities of fishing, and there were particularly strong emotional connection to past and present boats. Boats were often conceived as being part of their family. Another theme that came out in interviews was that the smells of fishing, for example, the sea, fishing equipment, fish, diesel, they were all sort of smells that contributed to these women's well-being, and particularly so daughters that grew up in fishing families. And also I found that women tended to also very often be part of sort of development programs, sort of environmental and fisheries development programs, and that these were sort of spaces in which these women could practice their belongings to fishing in sort of more undisputed ways, i.e. they didn't have to challenge any gender ideas in doing that. So sort of belonging is plural. They both confirm and challenge gender notions of inclusions and exclusion by practicing their belonging, and it helps us shed the light on those that do not necessarily identify with a specific fishing identity, and how they too may also embody a sense of belonging to fishing. And yeah, I think I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to flag this because this is, again, a paper that I've written on women's entrepreneurship in the fishing context. And the sort of rationale for doing that was that there's been some calls for fishing businesses to become more entrepreneurial or to add value to fishing catches as in response to sort of economic downturns in the sector. But these calls had to date been kind of gender blind, and I was trying to make sense of how we can understand women's entrepreneurship, or how women are a part of that context in which entrepreneurship in fishing takes place. So yeah, I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip this. And so just to say some final conclusions. So this is a quote from one of the papers I wrote, and it's saying that any policy that omits the roles women play in fishing communities and places, even when there are no collective identities that women go by, will fail to fully understand how such places and communities change or remain changed over time. So it's if there is an ambition to sort of develop these the fishing industry or fishing places, then we need to take this we have to understand fishing through this gendered lens, basically. And I didn't speak about entrepreneurship now, but I think the important point here is to say that entrepreneurship is an important concept to actually, because a lot of the time in policy discourse we talk about fisheries diversification, but that renders sort of women or the gendered aspect quite invisible. So actually be able to take women seriously, it's important to think about it through the lens of entrepreneurship, and because otherwise there's this danger that we assume and position women's entrepreneurial work as secondary to that of fishermen and not on this sort of equal footing. And I suppose another point that's kind of sort of extends the research that I did is that we still don't have a complete picture of women's roles in official statistics. And this would obviously be helpful to inform policy, but I think work that I did and others have done on sort of the cultural aspects of fishing is very important in that effort, because it does help to explain why, for example, people don't self-identify as being part of the fishing industry. And in the name of equality, diversity, and inclusivity, I also want to highlight that gender is obviously not the only marginalized position in fishing. And then at the very end here, I just wanted to bring your attention to a network for UK women in fisheries that has been developed. It's actually a community interested company at the moment, and they're supported by the Seafarers charity. And they've taken over the previous project website, which is now theirs. It's women-fisheries.com, and you can just sign up to become a member there if you're interested. Thank you very much. And here are some other resources.
Thank you so much, Madeline. That was really fascinating, and some really great themes that had come up that haven't been discussed by our previous speakers. I mean, I think there was some overlap with our previous two sessions, and there were topics around opportunity and representation. There was a topic around invisibility, actually, and that seems like there's come through quite clearly with your talk as well, that kind of placing women as being quite invisible. And I really found I actually really liked the section you were talking about on entrepreneurship, and that does not equal diversification, and those things are separate. And actually, to create these equal and equitable fishing communities, perhaps there's a need for these gendered funding programs or initiatives that actually recognize the role of women and promote and advocate for the role of women in these communities. So thank you so much for those really great points and for drawing on so much of your own work. I will get some of the references that Madeline was mentioning, and I'll put them underneath the recording of this, so we'll get the paper so you'll be able to access those as well. And I would now like to welcome our second speaker of the session, Katja Hershik, who is a PhD student at the University of Glasgow. She is going to be talking to us about her PhD work, which she'll be talking about some work that she did as part of an internship placement with Marine Scotland last year, and some of the work that was done through, I guess, kind of aligning with some of our aspirations as the Social Science Task Group. So Katja, I will hand over to you while you're getting your. Can you see me okay, Emma? I can see you fine, yeah.
Okay, because my screen went completely weird, but as long as you can see me.
I can see you, yeah. No problem. So while you're getting your slides up, I will just remind everybody, if you have any questions for either Madeline or Katja, please pop them in the Q&A box or in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on them, and I'll look at those once Katja's finished her talk. Katja, we can see your slides perfectly. We can see you and hear
I can
you.
see myself as well, so that's great.
So off you go. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Emma, for the introduction, and thank you so much for your talk, Madeline. I looked at kind of your work a lot during my internship, and so it's been really nice to meet you and listen to this talk. So as Emma said, I'm a PhD student, so I'm usually working on labour, migration, and fisheries, but today I'll be presenting some of the work that I did during a 3-month policy-oriented internship that I did with Marine Scotland last autumn. So during the internship, I did a review of literature, government documentation, and research reports. I didn't do any new data collection, unfortunately, because of time constraints, but I tried to, as I'm drawing on a lot of other people's work, I try to include references on slides as I go along, but I'm also happy to pass on the full reference list of the report if anyone's interested. So at the start of the internship, I started by a discussion with colleagues in the Scottish Government, in DEFRA, and Seafish, and these discussions helped to construct some of the key questions that will inform my discussion today. The main thing that I'll be focusing on is what are the perceived and lived challenges for women in Scottish fisheries. But then I'd also like to draw on how other intersectional factors contribute to the experiences of women in fisheries, and what are kind of the next steps in supporting women in fishing communities in Scotland. Okay. So I'll start by just outlining some current Scottish Government policy directives on the topic. The current programme for governance for a fairer, greener Scotland prioritises women in agriculture and emphasises sustainable marine economy. The Scottish National Performance Framework calls for quality jobs and fair work for everyone, but neither one of these specific none of these specify provisions for women in fisheries. But this topic is explicitly mentioned in the Future Fisheries Management Strategy, which I think informed my internship in general. And a key aim of this strategy is to, quote, promote involvement across all genders and equalities groups in a positive and inclusive way. And then kind of indirectly linked to this topic is the Fair Work Action Plan, which is said to be central to achieving sustainable and inclusive growth in Scotland. And I think in fishing, it's really important to draw on this and think about things like equality and safety more broadly. And this action plan also acknowledges that it's that a movement towards fair work will require changes to attitudes, cultures, policies, and practices. Now, like Madeline, I'm very much a qualitative researcher, but I did look at some statistics. So Seafish data reports, their employment surveys that Seafish undertook kind of as part of employment surveys into fisheries in the UK, indicate that about 1% of employees in offshore work in Scotland are women. Looking at onshore employment, this number is much higher, kind of reflecting what Madeline was talking about. And so, for example, their most recent survey on seafood processing staff in Scotland indicates that about 38% of people working there are women. And yeah, as that 15% number that Madeline also mentioned seems kind of vaguely correct, but it is possible that these numbers are kind of even officially higher in Scotland. And it's important to note here that when I was talking to Seafish, they mentioned that their surveyors think that perhaps the surveys are underrepresenting women because they're also underrepresenting onshore staff. So kind of when talking to people, they'll get a lot of like talking to skippers or employers in fisheries, they'll obviously report all of their staff on vessels, but they might be underreporting people working onshore, and more of those are likely to be women, which is kind of resonates all these reports on women in fisheries that have been done. So I was looking at two qualitative studies that had been taken on. The slightly older study by DEFRA from 2010, and then the Women Fisheries Project that Madeline mentioned just at the end there, where, and both of these reports kind of echo these statistics. So women are much more likely to work onshore and do kind of unpaid work supporting families and communities, things like net mending, caretaking, bookkeeping. Both of these studies also indicate that there are incidences of unequal treatments on the basis of gender in the industry. And yeah, basically this idea of the fishermen and kind of looking only at offshore work needs to be challenged by looking at women's contributions, both paid and unpaid work in both offshore and onshore employment. So this overview of existing reports leads to a more specific discussion of challenges for women in fisheries and fishing communities. And here I'd like to note that I acknowledge that I'm focusing very much on the negatives and on the challenges, and that there are loads of kind of more positive experiences and personal accounts of women who work and live in fishing communities. But I'm focusing, because I'm kind of looking at potential future policy changes, I'm focusing more on the challenges just now. And I was drawing, because this was a kind of Scotland specific project, I was drawing on literature on women in fisheries kind of globally, and then on more local Scottish reports on women on Scottish agriculture and women in Scottish aquaculture, to get more of a sense of how these things, which ones of these things coming up globally could be most applicable to Scotland. So all these challenges are connected, but I divided them into practical, socioeconomic, and cultural for the purposes of this presentation. So I'll start with practical challenges, and the first and big one that is consistently identified is training provisions. So learning in fishing communities tends to be intergenerational, so male members of fishing families might spend on boats from an early age, while women are less likely to do so, either because of their own personal choice or because of sociocultural factors. And then beyond this, there's limited training that exists for adults. So there's some college courses and apprenticeships, but these are very much bound to specific places where you can actually take them. There's also ongoing training. For example, DEFRA's UK Seafood Fund is developing, or I mean, I was doing this internship in autumn, so perhaps these training opportunities have already been developed. But in general, when these training opportunities are developed, it's essential that they're relevant, accessible, and promoted to women, so that women are consulted to assess what kind of training they would most like to take on, to ensure that there's training provided for those onshore roles as well, and so that they're consulted on how the trainings could be most accessible to them, for example, to fit around caring commitments. Another thing that consistently comes up, not just in literature, but also in kind of reports in women in some other sectors comparable to fisheries, is equipment. So most fishing gear, vessels, toilets aboard, and clothing for fishing has been developed with male fishers in mind. And the consequences of this can range from inconvenience on the one hand, but also safety concerns, because certain equipment could be too heavy for safe use by smaller people. And this is kind of tied to general safety concerns that I'll talk about in a minute. Moving on to socioeconomic challenges. A big kind of challenge that leans quite heavily into the cultural side of things is inheritance practices. So it tends to be men who inherit vessels and businesses, and women are often pursuing, maybe more often led into pursuing non-fisheries work. And that could be by choice, but in general, those kind of practices could lead to inequalities in access to business capital within fishing communities and fishing families. Then gender pay gap exists in fisheries as much as in other industries. I'm also referring to that report by Zhao et al. That in terms of gender pay gap, so it's quite dated, but in terms of gender pay gap, it suggests that women earn about 70% of what men make across processing and aquaculture. But there's very much a lack of updated data, very much a lack of Scottish specific data, and very much a lack of data on when it comes to offshore work. And so this gender pay gap has to firstly be addressed before it's even, must firstly be assessed before it's even addressed. And here again, it's important to pay attention to differentials between onshore and offshore work. And also importantly, a lot of women's work in fishing communities is unpaid, which should also kind of be addressed through a separate inquiry. Another consistent theme that comes across, again, both in fisheries and in other sectors, but is quite important in Scotland, because only 11% of rural councils in Scotland report sufficient childcare provisions. So that means that women can be stopped from re-entering the workforce once they've had children. And even though that's kind of a national issue and should be addressed on a bigger level, there's a need also for kind of local consultations and a need to identify the needs of local communities. So this Women in Agriculture Task Force has done an interesting piece of work on this topic, and they worked with women to identify practical needs for kind of very specific communities, and things that they called for were things like seasonably flexible hours, transport provisions, subsidized transport, financial subsidies, and also better routes into childcare for rural residents. And I think these concerns around childcare in Scotland are particularly tied to some of those smaller fishing communities. And would obviously, it would be really important to address these. And finally, most of the challenges that I've kind of talked through just now do stem from the cultural context and are at least somehow related to, the cultural situation. So women often report a consistent theme in literature on women in fisheries is invisibility. And that kind of happens at two levels. So on the one hand, the work that women traditionally do is not always considered fishing, kind of what Madeline was just talking about, even if it's actually crucial to running the business of selling and catching fish. But on another level, it also means that this invisibility comes through because women are often not included in policy discussions or in consultations. And even when they kind of are included, when they're in the room, they perhaps don't feel comfortable speaking. And there's an interesting piece of work by, I think, Natalie Ross in the new Researching People in the Sea book, where she kind of talks about how when she interviewed full families or a fisheries kind of spouse couple, or when she would go to consultations, women would kind of be quite quiet, or they wouldn't necessarily even be there. But when interviewed on their own, they expressed loads of opinions and loads of information. You know, they've had loads of information. So it just kind of emphasizes the point that it's really important to provide spaces where women can speak about their own experiences. Another point that I kind of, I think it comes from an article that Madeline actually didn't speak about, but I really liked it. And it was about establishing, like, acknowledging the positive fishing identity for women. And it ties around all those things that she talked about, belonging and kind of need for representation. But what kind of stuck with me is that there's this idea of a strong and successful male fisherman that's very well developed in our social imaginations, but it's heavily gendered and it doesn't necessarily transpose to women's experiences. And women, even when they're working on vessels, will often emphasize their roles as mothers or caregivers or providers. But this kind of fishing identity is not usually represented in discourse and in policy. So when we're talking about policy, it's really important to then both bring women into the discussion, but also kind of acknowledge their experiences. There's also broader challenges for fisheries in general that indirectly impact women in industry and fishing communities, and that's the public perception of the industry. So the public tends to perceive the industry as dangerous and not financially lucrative. Obviously, it's not always the case, but doing a bit of a generalization. And these themes and issues are worth addressing in their own right, but when it comes to women's employment, it's important to also acknowledge women's agency and aspirations on whether or not they wish to enter the sector. So beyond just kind of bringing more women into fisheries and providing more training for them, there's a need for diverse and sustainable employment opportunities in coastal communities, not just within fisheries, also beyond, so that employment within the sector is a choice, not a necessity. And a final point here is that it's very much worth remembering that traditional fishing communities are often proudly independent and resistant to kind of external regulations and policies. So while there's, I mean, I guess quite a number of practical suggestions here, it's more, I guess, a matter of slow cultural changes and a kind of conversational approach to these topics and working with fishing communities. So a brief interlude on COVID. Not that much has been published on the impact of COVID on women in fisheries specifically, because it's quite a niche topic, I suppose. But studies on the impact of COVID on women in general highlight the additional caring responsibilities that women have generally undertaken in society during the pandemic. Women are also more likely to put their careers on hold in times of crisis. And there's also lots of literature that says that women often hold more precarious positions in the industry or undertake kind of ad hoc jobs, which will have influenced, in the UK context and in the Scottish context, perhaps their access to furlough and similar schemes. So yeah, just wanted to mention COVID here because in these kind of recent times of quote unquote recovery and discussions following both COVID and Brexit in fisheries and their impact on fisheries, it's just really important to kind of draw on what I was saying earlier about invisibility and ensure that women's voices are kept involved in the process and in the discussions surrounding kind of the future of fisheries in Scotland. So I said I would kind of consider briefly the intersectional factors when talking about fisheries and kind of move beyond gender just briefly, because obviously a large number of parts of our own identities influence our experiences in the world, and likewise they influence people's experiences living and working in fisheries and fishing communities. So something that's come up quite consistently is race and nationality, and I believe this kind of leads into the broader theme of this seminar series, not just this particular topic today. But to launch into some examples, around 35% of all workers in seafood processing in Scotland are from outside the UK. Most of them are women from Eastern Europe. So it's worth considering how they've been impacted by some of these recent changes to settlement programs. Then the cat sector employs migrants, quite a lot of migrants from the Philippines and Ghana, and current regulations severely restrict their terms of employment. Things like their movement within the UK, entry regulations in terms of skill, and there's also reports that they kind of are remunerated differently. So race and nationality are also important factors to consider here. Another intern while I was at Marine Scotland did a review on employment and progression in fisheries, and some interesting things about age came out. So for example, young people often experience barriers to entry due to existing succession practices, especially young people from poorer communities. They kind of know that they'll face barriers to progression due to cost. It's kind of hard to save both for your own life and for your own family, as well as to buy a vessel or buy quotas on a deckhand salary. So kind of class and age are quite important. And then on the other side of the age spectrum, the catch sector workforce is aging, and as fishing is quite difficult, grueling work, and there's lots of reported crew shortages. It means that fishers are placed at higher risk of injury or long-term health effects, and that might delay their retirement or might influence their retirement. So yeah, just a couple examples to highlight the importance of like an intersectional approach. There's also loads of other factors that we can hopefully consider in the discussion. So yeah, I kind of mentioned a lot of different examples and possibilities in supporting women in fisheries as I was talking through the challenges, but I thought I'd just highlight a couple. So kind of large-scale research projects have already been done on like a national level, but I think some local inquiries that are specific to Scotland or even at a smaller scale could be quite useful, kind of mirroring the work that's being done in women in agriculture. There's also loads of networks. So the Women in Fisheries Network, Women in Scottish Aquaculture Network, the Women in Welsh Fisheries Network in Wales. And these networks have been shown to be quite useful for women. They can streamline training opportunities, employment opportunities. They're a good source for kind of consultations, but also I was just reading some articles about the Women in Welsh Fisheries group, and they mentioned how useful it's been for them to kind of have a space where they can just talk to people with very similar experiences on a very kind of simple level. So it's really important that these networks are supported. And finally, again, mirroring Madeline's point from earlier, it's important to highlight the existing work of women and formalize kind of the unpaid work that's being done. And one of the ways that it's been done kind of in other places is by formalizing the roles of fishing spouses so that they can access things like maternity, or that they have more secure situations in, say, cases of divorce. So yeah, those are like 3 key points. Obviously, there's a need to close those evidence gaps that I've mentioned before, generally work on safety and work-life balance in fisheries, and include women's voices in kind of discussions of future fisheries. But I'm not going to go more in depth here. So yeah, just a final concluding point. I put up here some keywords to consider together, and I think again here I'm kind of drawing on that Women in Fisheries project, where report, or one of the kind of outputs from there that I found quite useful to think through the future of fisheries in general, I guess, but integrating gender and equality and diversity within this conversation, is that if you create a more attractive and supportive environment for women that's more attuned to safety, work-life balance, that might direct us towards achieving a more equitable and sustainable industry on the whole, being a bit kind of hopeful and optimistic for the end. But in general, an industry that promotes equal access to training, that's inclusive to people of all genders, people with caring responsibilities, and has diverse representation in leadership, can then be more resilient to future challenges. And a more inclusive industry, in turn, is safer, attracts workforce, and is then more resilient to regulations that address environmental change and then socioeconomic changes and so on. So I'll just finish here to give us like 10 minutes for discussion.
Thank you so much, Katja. That was really fascinating. And I think between both you and Madeline, Madeline, I'll invite you to come back on screen now as well. There's just so much to think about. And for me, one of the crucial things I think that's come out of both of your talks is that, you know, this isn't just about fisheries. This is about addressing if we're working towards a sustainable blue economy, it seems this be what we're aiming for, right? But it has to be across policy. It has to be across different areas. It's about childcare. It's about equal pay. It's about access to training, capacity building, safety. Somebody's tweeted about it and used the hashtag Invisible Women, and there's a whole book that makes me very cross about that, which I could recommend to lots of people. But it is about so many different aspects, and I think you've both covered that really, really well. Thank you so much for that. I'm conscious that today's session, both of our speakers have been talking about gender and fisheries. Of course, that is not to in any way diminish any other areas where gender relates to marine and coastal topics, and we'd be really open and welcome to anybody who would be interested in speaking on any of those topics. But I think it's been really interesting to think about those cross-cutting themes and how diverse the challenges are, really. I mean, there's so much around lack of visibility, lack of understanding of the role of women, a real need for closing those evidence gaps and more data. And it sounds like more data of all sorts, more of what you do, Madeline, the qualitative understanding, more of the quantitative, like how many women are there, what do they do? Yeah, there's so much that we could do better, I think, and lots of recommendations for those who are working in the industry, working in policy, that are listening to this talk that they could maybe draw on. So I'm going to go to some of our questions. We've had some great ones coming in from the audience. Please keep them coming. We've got about 8 minutes or so I'll try and get through as many as possible. Madeline, the first one's for you. It's from Bethany Wills, who said, to your knowledge, is there an increase in the number of women getting involved in the fishing sector in England post 2012? I wonder whether the movement of people to rural locations or people wanting to spend more time outside and work personal life might have had any effect. I wonder if post 2012 should be later, but anyway, so if you know if there's been an increase in the number of women getting involved in fisheries.
Thanks. Sorry, the question. Okay, so I don't actually know that. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I mean, the shame with as you was. Thanks so much for your talk, by the way, Kate. That was amazing. But as you were saying, there hasn't been a lot of work on COVID-19 impacts on fishing and how that sort of taps in with all of that, and it's a shame to sort of the timing of the project didn't cover any of that, because it field work ended. It was actually good from my point of view, because field work cannot you haven't been able to do field work during this time in the same way, but it finished just before that, and then I was like moving on in doing lots of other things. But I mean, just from sort of I don't want to say anecdotal, but from Twitter and from conversations with people, I know that a lot of women have been picking up that sort of entrepreneurial role in fishing more, also because like some of the markets totally collapsed, right? So yeah, I've definitely seen some of that happening. That's not really answering the question, but if it was supposed to be 2021 or the impacts of COVID, I definitely see that women have taken a role in sort of picking up, trying to, I suppose, mitigate some of those challenges that have emerged.
Thanks, Madeline. Katja, how about you? Have you seen anything? Did you see anything in the evidence that you were looking at for your internship that those numbers had changed over time, increased or decreased?
Yeah, anecdotally as well. I've definitely seen more non-academic articles talking about it. I don't know whether that's a reflection of just making existing people more visible, or whether that's a reflection of more people getting into it. Anecdotally, yes, but I don't think in terms of like significant numbers. But again, it's just my own impression.
And I guess part of that comes down to the fact that, as you've both said, we don't have enough information. We don't have enough data or evidence on those points, and there's a big gap in our knowledge. So that's something we need to look at. Ed, you very politely raised your hand. So why don't you come on
just
screen?
really quickly, because I partially know the answer why there is no more data, and where some might come from is like so a lot of the data for UK fisheries for like on gender information, especially on the catching sector, comes from the fleet survey conducted by Seafish, and the questions have been updated there in recent years, but the data has lagged. So you should soon see through better estimates for gender diversity within the fleet, including within the crew and hopefully onshore as well, in some of those unpaid or underrepresented roles.
Thanks, Ed. And Beth, thank you for clarifying in the Q&A box as well. Sorry for misinterpreting that. I wasn't sure. I'm going to go to another question. Going to go to one from Rebecca Jefferson, who's asked both of you, said thank you for great presentations, and has asked, interested to know how your research findings have been received by fishers and agencies who might either support further research or support change in the industry. Katya, I'm going to invite you to go first because you did it for an agency, and then
yeah, exactly. So that's why I was kind of struggling to come up with an answer to that. Is that I suppose Marine Scotland were very welcoming and wanted me to do this this report, and also I did have quite a few conversations with kind of fisheries organisations and kind of people a little bit outside of the government as well. And generally, this kind of research is not necessarily it's kind of encouraged, and no one was negative about it, but that's obviously, you know, we'll see what kind of happens with the results and findings and so on. But in general, it is kind of embedded in current policy and kind of future governance plans as well. So that's kind of my answer.
Thank you. Madeleine, anything to add?
No, I mean, I'm just trying to think. Like, I've done a few like sort of webinars with the industry present, and I think generally people have been, you know, finding it interesting and all of that stuff. Potentially, I think there's something that is slightly problematic in the how people define fisheries differently, right?
Yeah.
So like maybe my definition of a fishery is a bit wider, I suppose, than maybe some of the fishers or the fishing agencies that I've engaged with. But that's kind of that's the interesting thing, like, because these forms of projects and this form of research is done to kind of challenge perspectives, right? So in a way that's perfectly natural and that's perfectly fine. But I think people have generally been very friendly and interested. So yeah.
Great.
But yeah, I think that's potentially what it is, that we're talking about slightly different understandings of fisheries.
Yeah. That topic of gender and within fisheries actually came up as one of the priority areas where we needed more information in the marine social science work that I did a couple of years ago for DEFRA. And so and that was kind of brought from a real range of people. So I think, as you know, you both said that it's fairly positive responses. I think people probably recognize that there is that knowledge gap and that we need to know more of those informal and formal roles that women play, and of different age groups, I guess, as well. Drawing on some of what Katya was saying as well. Madeleine, go ahead.
Can I just add to that? Because obviously, like, the work that has been done within the UK Women in Fisheries network, I mean, there are women that are part of the industry in that group, obviously, led by them. So, you know, they clearly felt the need to do something about this, and I'm assuming they're a fisheries agency as well, in a way, right? A fisheries organization. So yeah, I mean, there's been a need to do something in a more practical sense around these issues.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And then one final question. So there's Madeleine, I don't know if you've seen it, I think you might have done. There's a really great comment for you in the Q&A box from Maria. So hopefully you've seen that, but I don't think there's a question as such. But in the chat box, there was a question, which I think, although it was for Madeleine, I think it's for both of you really. And the question is around how, what policy or management recommendations could be improved by better taking account of the role of women in fisheries. So I will close with that question to both of you, not a small question. So what could be improved essentially by better including the role of women? And I went to Katya first last time, so I'm going to come to you first this time, Madeleine, then Katya, I'll come to you.
So sorry, I just need a second to think. I think Katya was saying something very brilliant at the end of your presentation about sort of like designing fishing policies as, you know, taking from a perspective that is good for everyone, like women included, means that it's effectively like a better fishing industry, or a more but I suppose you said it much better than I'm doing it now, but provide an example of how, I mean, so if you, for example, look at the resilience of fishing businesses over time, I think that is taking the wider context of how fishing is done into consideration, which you end up doing if you take a gender lens on the fishing industry. You're able to see a much more complete picture of how the industry is able to sustain itself over time. And I think that's pretty much what fishing policy is often concerned with, right? So
improve resilience and overall sustainability would be improved by better including the role of women. Katja, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it feels weird because it would just summarize everything that I said in terms of like,
it's a big
I think there's loads of practical smaller things, like in terms of accessibility of trainings, accessibility of, I don't know, the right size of equipment that is very practical and can be done on a very pragmatic kind of short-term time scale. And then there's loads of these other issues that, like you just said, about resilience, also about kind of sustainability, safety, that are obviously much larger scale projects but would benefit everyone. And I think, I mean, just even I've talked to some fishers recently, and they were talking about things like, lack of being able to hire people, so they feel a bit more unsafe on vessels and stuff like that. So safety is obviously probably should be the #1 priority in that sense, and well-being. But yeah, I don't think I can provide a better answer just now.
That's okay. That's great. Thank you. Thank you both so much. We're just a little bit over the half hour, so I'm going to bring this to a close, but just to thank you both so much for such fascinating talks. And you really highlighted some really important points. And although I said that there wasn't, there were different themes, I think there was again some overlap around these issues of visibility and providing opportunities, whether that's opportunities for training, for capacity building, for understanding that broader fishing community and what that means, and who does all of those roles within that, and some really great suggestions of how we can better include the role of women, but also better understand what they need to be able to be involved in a safe and in a way that is good for their well-being and all of those different issues that you mentioned. Thank you so much to all of you who've joined us today. We had a really great audience, and thank you for some great questions and comments. As I said, the recording of the session will be available on the MarSocSci YouTube channel probably within the next couple of days, and we'll also be disseminating our newsletter and through the SMMR program as well. So there's lots of ways for you to get your hands on it if you missed anything or you joined late. If there are any papers or reports that our speakers have mentioned, I'll try my best to get hold of them, or at least get the links and pop them underneath the recording as well. And if anybody would like to be put in touch with either Katja or Madeline, I'm sure I can help facilitate that if that would be of use. So our final session in this series, this co-sponsored series, will be held in the next couple of weeks. We're just finalising the date. As I said, that will be on Youth Voices. They both disappeared and left me all to myself. We'll be on Youth Voices, and we're just finalising this programme of speakers and the date and time for that, but we'll get that information to you very soon. And just again, thank you very much. Take care, stay safe, everybody, and hope to see you joining us again soon. And thank you again to Katja and Madeline.
Thank you, Emma.
Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.